Good evening, brothers and sisters. I'm so touched to see such a fantastic turnout. I didn't expect this. I thought maybe 20, 30 people, but it turned out to be quite a good show up. Very good. So thank you very much for coming. Of course, wish that it would be a happier occasion, but unfortunately we have lost a very good teacher just 2 weeks ago. And therefore, it is not easy for many of us to take this, but I guess we just have to carry on, move forward. So for me, personally, in moving forward, I think the best thing I can do is to collect and compile whatever I've learned from our good teacher, Venerable Dr. Punnaji, and put together a lesson starting from the very, very beginning, the fundamental things that he has taught. So the lesson I have prepared for today is actually one of the most fundamental things that the Bhante has always taught. And if we don't understand this, it will be quite difficult to go on and try to understand many of the things that he had been teaching. Because a lot of the time he refers to the mind and the body. And if we don't understand the correlation, we don't understand the differences, we don't understand it from an experiential point of view, then we will have some difficulty trying to understand some of his deeper teachings, which I will do later in the year. And I hope I can continue next year as well. So at least for now, I have planned quite a number of lessons, 6 lessons, 2 in August, 1 in September, and then 3 more in October. So the first most fundamental thing that Bhante has always taught us is really about the mind and body. What is mind, what is body, how they differ, and very often he makes references to it, so this understanding is important. The first thing he often says is asking the question, who are we? So he always says we are organisms in an environment. So if you look at an organism in an environment, it's basically a body trying to survive in a complex world, a lot of things happening. So this is our real world, our samsaric world. It is this body that is constantly experiencing the suffering. So let's understand what Bhante was trying to say when he says we are organisms in an environment. This statement is very profound because it simply points out that two words are not mentioned here. One word is called self. There is no self mentioned here. The second word is called the world. The world doesn't exist. There's an environment. Environment is everything happening. So Bhante always teaches us from an experiential perspective. So when he says environment, it is a very experiential word. Whereas if he says world, it is a physical existence. It's a very existential word. So Bhante is very, very wise. He was very wise. He always chose the right word. So when he said organisms in an environment, it is specifically from a very experiential perspective. Organism is not about the body. It's about the activity of the body. So there are 2 major activities going on in the body. The first activity is called metabolism. Metabolism is what keeps this body alive. It's a process. It's an activity that's constantly going on, where cells will absorb energy and then divide and multiply. Well, some people get confused. What is divide and multiply? Cells actually begin to divide. So 1 cell becomes 2, 2 cells become 4. So that's dividing. But in the process of dividing, the numbers are multiplying. So therefore, it's easy to understand when some people say cells are dividing, and then some other people say cells are multiplying. So don't worry, the 2 mean exactly the same thing. Cells absorb energy, they divide. 1 cell becomes 2, 2 cells become 4, 4 become 8, and so on. So it keeps multiplying, and therefore cells will multiply. So metabolism is that process going on. And that's going on in your body. Which means moment to moment, inside your body, cells are dividing. And in fact, scientists have more or less measured it. In a matter of 3 days, your skin is not the same anymore. In a matter of 7 days, a large part of your body is not the same anymore. And they even went as far as 7 years is all it takes for the bones inside your body to be completely replaced. So the bones inside your body is refreshed after 7 years. So the bones is not, after 7 years, your bones are not even the same bones you had. So therefore, that is what's going on all the time. That's why Bhante says organism in an environment. Because the organism is a continuously striving for existence. The other thing that's happening inside an organism is the process of consciousness because of the 5 sense organs or 5 senses, where it enables us to sense the environment and experience the environment. So it's a very experiential process that's going on. And this experience helps us to see what is out there in terms of light reflected from the objects, hear the sounds, smell the aroma, taste the flavors, and touch the tangible objects. So basically, this level of consciousness means we have these 5 senses continuously feeding information to the whole process of consciousness. So we're living in such a complex environment, and we have to understand basically what is then going on. So one of the first most important thing we have to understand is there is only this activity going on, and this activity is called mind. Mind does not exist. There is no such thing as an existence. Mind is purely an experience. It is an activity that's going on, and the only way you can know such an activity is going on is to experience the mind. Therefore, mind is an experiential process. Now I'm going to show you a 6-minute video. It's a bit lengthy. You don't have to jot down notes during the 6 minute because I have broken it down into 3 segments. So I'm going to show you first the full 6 minutes, which came from one of his very insightful and profound sharing back in 2014 when he was together with Uncle Vijaya, answering one simple little question from the audience. Is there a thinker when we are thinking? Interesting question. Do we need a thinker to think? So
we need a thinker to think. Is that the question? Do we need a thinker to think? Existentialism.
No, this is another kind of question where we have to get into a different way of thinking. The important thing is we have to understand that we have no thing called a mind. We only have a thing called a body. And what we call the mind, the Buddha used 3 words to refer to what is called the mind. Chitta, Mano, and Vijnana. These are the 3 things. And if we examine what these 3 things are, these are 3 activities of the body. There are 3 activities of the body that we refer to as mind. One is Vijnana. Vijnana simply means that we have in this body 5 senses: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the body itself. These senses, when stimulated by the environment, the senses react to that stimulus. That reaction is what is called Vijnana. Chakku Vijnana, the eye reacting. Sota Vijnana, the ear reacting. Gana Vijnana, nose reacting. Jivha Vijnana, tongue reacting. And Kaya Vijnana, the body reacting. That reaction is the main thing that we call Vijnana. Today it is translated as consciousness, which is not correct. It is really perception, not consciousness. Perception. Now, during the time of the Buddha, someone came and asked Buddha a question. We have these 5 senses, and each sense will give different information. The eye, the information we get from the eye is different from the information we get from the ear. It is a sound. And nose gives another kind of information. The tongue gives another kind of information. Now these different informations, they are different. But we mix these things together. Where does that mixing come? Where do they unite?
In the mind.
Then the Buddha said, Mano. Mano is the place. And today, if we use the modern scientific thinking, all these information going from the senses go to the brain. And the brain begins to do the thinking. Put that information together and compare it with the past experiences and gives a meaning. So when I see a person coming here, if I have seen that person before, I will know that person. Or if I don't, at least I will see whether it is a man or a woman, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So the meaning is given by the thinking part, which is mano, which is the activity of the brain. There is no thinker as a separate person. It is the brain, and there is a part of the brain called the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex, which is doing the thinking. And mano really is not another person there or anything, but the body itself. The brain is a part of the body.
So that if you cut off somebody's head, the brain is there, but there's no mind. It stops.
And then the other thing is, once you have given a meaning to what you saw, an emotion is aroused. That means you like that thing that you saw, or you hate that, or you are frightened of that, or you are worried about that. These are the emotions. And that emotional part is what the Buddha called chitta. So chitta is the emotional part, and according to the emotion that is aroused, an action takes place in the form of speech or behavior. And that is what is called karma. Karma is the action that goes. And the action can also have results, which may be, if you become angry and you begin to fight with people, other people might fight with you also. Or you might be taken to prison. These are the effects. Yeah. So those are the consequences of the action. So that is the vipaka. So all these things are just the body doing these things. There is no person or any mind as a separate thing that is doing anything.
So there's no thinker to do the thinking, so don't think.
And one of the biggest problems all of us suffer, and that's why we end up with dukkha, is overthinking. Okay, so let's take a look at what Bhante described as the 3 aspects of the mind, 3 activities going on. Remember, the mind does not exist. The brain exists. You cut up a person's head, you can take out the brain. But the mind is an activity that's going on. And this activity happens because brain cells are exchanging 2 things: electrical impulses or electricity and chemical. So the exchange of these 2 things cause activity going on in the brain, and that activity gives rise to this experience of the mind. So therefore, you have to think in experiential terms. If you really want to understand the mind, you cannot think of the mind as, like some people say, the mind is like a box containing memory. No. If the mind is like a box, then we are all square, So the mind is really an activity. So it's very important to remember this important statement. Mind as an activity. And there are three parts of mental experiences. In other words, the only way you know it is an activity is to experience it. There are three kinds of experiences we will encounter. The first is called vijnana, which is process of perception. And Bhante pointed out, of course, the translation as consciousness is not accurate. It's not entirely false because there are 6 sensual realms. 5 of them are the physical senses and the 6th one is mano. So mano vijnana is actually consciousness. But other aspects of vijnana, chakku vijnana, sota vijnana and so on, they are not consciousness. They are simply perceptions. I'll show that in a moment. So basically vijnana is really what was perceived through the sense organs. That means our sense organ bring in information about what we have seen in the environment because of light, what we have heard because of sound, what we have tasted and smelled and touched, right? And then the mind processes it. The mano aspect of the mind processes it. And this process is called cognitive process. There are 2 major functions going on, cognition and conception. Cognition simply means becoming aware of an object. Conception simply means giving meaning to what you are aware of. Just because you are aware there is an object does not mean you understand what it is. So there is an awareness and there is a meaning given to it. So basically, in a nutshell, mano as cognitive process is categorized interpretation of perception, giving meaning to what was perceived. And then there is the third aspect of the mind, the third activity going on that we experience, that is the affective process, chitta, commonly called emotion. And it leads to 2 conditions, mood and temperament. So emotion basically is our reaction, emotional reaction to pleasant or unpleasant feelings arising from what we have perceived. And it leads to some kind of emotional excitement, and then we begin to have a certain mood. If it is something pleasant, we like it. So the mood is good, feels good. If it is something unpleasant, we don't like it. Then we start to feel unhappy, dissatisfied. So that is mood. And in feeling the mood, we begin to behave differently. And that behavior is the result of our temper. If you have positive temper, you might do some nice things. If you have negative temper, you will be doing some crazy, unwholesome things. So that's why mood and temperament. Mood is what happens as a result of the feeling, and temperament is the reaction, right? So therefore, it is because of this feeling of whatever has been perceived. And this emotional reaction is tanha. There are 3 kinds of tanha. There is tanha because it is something pleasant. It is called lobha. Lobha means it is lust and greed. And there is also tanha because it is something unpleasant. It is called dosa. And there is also a reaction at the bottom of that. It says personalizing the experience leading to the notion of a self-centered existence. That is moha, the delusion of self-centered existence. Thinking that I, me, or mine exists. Now this aspect I'm going to explain in deeper details next week. So for this week, we're just looking at the mind as a whole and then the body. Next week, we're going to deep into details about mano and chitta. Right? So therefore, I won't go so much deeper about mano and chitta for now. Basically, these are the 3 activities going on. Earlier on, I showed you a very long video, so I've broken it down into 3 parts. The first part, Bhante spoke about vijnana, right? Perception.
The important thing is, we have to understand that we have no thing called a mind. We only have a thing called a body. And what we call the mind, the Buddha used 3 words to refer to what is called the mind. Chitta, mano, and vijnana. These are the three things. And if we examine what these three things are, these are three activities of the body. There are three activities of the body that we refer to as mind. One is vijnana. Vijnana simply means that we have in this body 5 senses: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the body itself. These senses, when stimulated by the environment, contact, the senses react to that stimulus. That reaction is what is called vijnana. Chakku vijnana, the eye reacting. Sota vijnana, the ear reacting. Gana vijnana, nose reacting. Jivha vijnana, tongue reacting. And kaya vijnana, the body reacting. That reaction is the main thing that we call vijnana. Today it is translated as consciousness, which is not correct. It is really perception, not consciousness. Perception.
So what's the difference between perception and consciousness? The word consciousness has many meanings. The reason is that the word itself does not refer to one condition of the mind. It is referring to different aspects at different dimensions depending on your perspective. What are you looking at? So I'll give you a simple example. When light enters the eye and then it stimulates the light-sensitive cells, it triggers impulses going to the brain, and then you become conscious of light. That is a form of consciousness. In that sense, consciousness is correct. The word consciousness is correct. It is consciousness of light frequency. But then consciousness can also mean something a little deeper. When a lot of different light-sensitive cells bring message to the brain, the impulses, and then it forms some kind of an image, then you become conscious of an image, and no longer just light alone, but also image. And that's another level of consciousness. Now you take it one level further. These different images come together to form a big picture. And that big picture is showing you what is in the environment. And then you become aware of the environment, aware of the world. And that is another level of consciousness. And then you can take it one level further. When you are aware of the environment, you are beginning to become aware that, oh, I am experiencing the environment. So you have a kind of awareness of this thing you call self. And then you begin to think that there is a self existing in the world. And that is another level of consciousness. And then this self has intellectual mind. It is able to think. It is able to create. It's able to invent. And you invent devices that can peep into the sky. And when you look up in the stars, you become aware that there are stars out there. There is a universe. We're living on a planet called Earth. Then you have another level of consciousness. And then consciousness is also one level further than that. Some people have this ability called ESP. Then we're talking about transcendental consciousness. So now you can see the word consciousness does not refer to one thing. It refers to so many different things. Therefore, to translate vijnana as consciousness can create a lot of confusion. Because some people would think consciousness means, oh, you're conscious of the world. No. Vijnana, you are only conscious of objects. That's all. Not even the big picture, just objects. Because you have not interpreted it yet. You have not given meaning to the object yet. That level of consciousness is very low level. So therefore the word perception is more accurate. You have perceived the image of an object. That's it, perception, right? So that's why perception is more accurate. Now what exactly did Bhante say? Here, word for word, he says, we do not have a thing called the mind. We only have a thing called the body. Remember the word a thing. What is a thing? A thing means something that exists. the body is something that we can define, having a form, something that exists. The mind has no form. We can't define the mind. So, and the Buddha used 3 words to describe, to refer to the mind. Chitta, Mano, Vijnana. And these are the activities of the body. Now, Bhante used the word the body. Basically, the reason is very simple. The body is made up of the brain, the spinal cord, which make up the central nervous system, and then the rest of the body made up of peripheral nervous system and sense organs and all the different systems like the digestive system, the respiratory system, and so on. Right? So that whole thing is really the body. The mind primarily is the activity of the brain, but it is not only the activity of the brain. The mind is also the activity of your sense organs. Vijnana is the activity of your sense organ. Right? And sense organ is not inside the brain. So therefore, the Bhante uses the word the body. He does not stick to just only the word brain. Some people say, the mind is only in the brain, but that's not correct. Right? Because when you talk about Vijnana, which is sensing the environment, it is not being sensed by the brain. It is being sensed by the sense organ, feeding information to the brain. So Vijnana is the reaction of the senses to stimulations from environment. And Vijnana is often translated as consciousness. Therefore, it is not really very accurate. I wouldn't want to say it's wrong, but it's not accurate. And it is really perception. So if you look at it, the body is made of the central nervous system plus the rest of the body. The central nervous system is made of 2 main parts. Right? This image is not in your notes, so don't worry about it. It's not so critical. The central nervous system is made of 2 main parts, the brain and the spinal cord, and then it's connected to the peripheral nervous system, which is connected to all your sense organs and the rest of the body, and feeding information to the brain, and there's activity in the brain. And the activity in the brain is because of information being fed to the brain by various sense organs. So, for example, your eyeball will be picking up light and sending stimulations to sending these impulses to the brain through the optic nerves. Your eardrum is picking up sound and translating them into impulses sent through the auditory nerves, and your nose is picking up smells, aromas, and turning it into impulse and sent through the olfactory nerves. In the same way, the tongue and so on, and the body also sending information to the brain. And then the brain processes it. At this point, it is very important also to understand some basic fundamental information about the brain and how it evolved. Because this is also fundamental to understanding a lot of the things the Buddha taught. Because some people say, our original mind, I'm sure everyone has heard that, and it's correct. Our original mind is pure. And then some people say, our original mind is chitta. Now, Bhante has very clearly differentiated chitta and mano. So why do we say our original mind is chitta? That is correct also. Bhante is referring to the modern human being, where we have chitta and mano. But in the original brain as it evolved, it started with only the brain stem. The earliest organisms only had something resembling the brain stem to keep it alive. And life began in the oceans because of the chemical reactions in the oceans. In those days, the ocean is not like today. The water is very hot and acidic, and all the compounds, they come together and somehow evolve into some kind of living cells. And that's where life began in the oceans. So we're going to need to take a look at how the human brain or the human being evolved, right? So going back to beginning of time, life began in the ocean. So the only real life form at that time were the fish. Now the fish brain was very, very primitive. Basically only the brain stem with very little limbic system. I'll go back to the earlier screen here. Yeah, I should mention here. The modern human brain can be divided into 3 layers. The innermost, most primitive layer is the brain stem. This is the oldest part of the brain that started evolving. Then it started to get wrapped around with the middle part of the brain called the limbic system, and that's what is emotional brain, where emotion began to evolve. And then after that, the brain itself grew a 3rd layer, started to wrap around with the cerebral cortex, the thinking brain. So in other words, only in very advanced and high-level organisms will you find cerebral cortex. Mammals and human beings, basically. Well, human being is a mammal. A human is a mammal. So in mammals, you will find cerebral cortex. In some birds, you will also find a fairly evolved cerebral cortex. That's why some birds are very intelligent. They know how to solve certain problems because they have a thinking brain of some sort. And insects do not have these. And if we talk about reptiles, then they only have the limbic system. They don't have the thinking brain, right? And only some reptiles may have a very little bit of thinking brain, but most of it, reptiles are not able to solve problems because you need a thinking brain to find solutions to problems, solving problems. So reptiles basically just react to dangers without being able to think how to solve problems. And that's really how the brain has evolved, starting from the brain stem, which is the very primitive brain that keeps the organism alive. It started to evolve limbic system, which is an emotional brain, allowing the organism to become aware of threats and dangers and avoiding dangers. And then finally, cerebral cortex able to start solving problems. So let's take a look at how it all began. Going back to the beginning of time, that firstly, there was only the fish in the oceans. And they only have basically the part of the brain that keeps it alive. And that is the brain stem, basically. The fish brain is very primitive. Now, you know that when you have fish in your fish tank, you tap on the fish tank. Is the fish afraid of you? The fish not really. They can come near, you just tap, he won't be afraid unless, of course, it came too close, you're almost touching it, it may move away. But if the fish is there and you're knocking on the glass, the fish is not afraid because the fish has no fear, so to speak. It is just trying to stay alive by feeding. And that's what happened to fish. Fish started to evolve, some species of fish started to evolve a little bit of limbic system. That means the emotional brain started to become fearful of bigger fish. And because of that, some species of fish started to find its way onto land. And when they found the way into land, the whole body also evolved. So the fin became legs and they crawl onto land and became amphibians. You know, amphibians survive in water and survive on land. Amphibians. When they crawl onto land, they evolve into amphibians, and then they crawl further and then started to evolve into reptiles, which can no longer survive fully in the water. They can swim, but they still need to breathe air, they still need to survive on land. Even the crocodile cannot stay underwater forever. Right? And then reptiles start to crawl up the trees, and then started to evolve, and evolved into birds. And it is birds that evolve into dinosaurs. So basically, scientists are now more or less, now nobody can prove beyond doubt, right? But scientists are beginning to accept this proposal that basically dinosaurs are birds. But of course, there are still other scientists who dispute that. What is happening here? When reptiles crawl up the trees and started to evolve into bird-like creatures, right? They then started to develop the thinking brain. Because by the time they got onto land and became reptiles, the limbic system has evolved. Right? And then they evolved into birds, and then from birds, it evolved into mammals. Now, this is a very complex process. I'm oversimplifying it. Scientists are not in agreement. There are many different theories. Because these historical things are all nothing but theories. Nobody can prove. So one group of scientists will say one thing, and that's probably the report you saw. Another group of scientists will say another thing. Who is right, who is wrong, nobody can prove who is right, who is wrong, because nobody was there. And the evidence was not adequate to really prove beyond doubt. So I would suggest to you, if you're looking through these scientific reports about ancient times, if it goes back to a time where evidence is not easy to be fully tested and substantiated, then just take it with a pinch of salt. Otherwise, you could be developing maybe some inaccurate views. So, from bird to mammals, and then they start to come down from the trees and started evolve into mammals, four-legged animals, and then somehow these four-legged animals started to stand on 2 feet, and standing on 2 feet eventually became humans. That's really the whole process in a very simplified manner. I'm not here to give you scientific evidence to prove this, but this is basically a very simplified picture of what really more or less happened. Right? In the broad sense, I think many scientists will not disagree with this. This is broadly what has happened. Let's take a look at the origin of land animals. It's important because that's how the brain became more sophisticated. That's how we started to have this thinking brain. Around 380 years, a million years ago, and this is billion, 380 million years ago, scientists could not find any evidence of land animals, four-legged land animals. So in other words, land animals, four-legged and land animals did not exist 380 million years ago. But they did find some, right? Later on. So animal life only existed in the oceans as all kinds of sea creatures, and then they began to find evidence of four-legged land animals around 360 million years ago. The very ancient species of land animals, four-legged. Four-legged doesn't mean mammals. It's mostly amphibians and reptiles. So there is a missing link in between. So scientists believe there is this missing link between 360 to 380 million years ago. So a lot of scientists went around the world to look for them. And one scientist struck gold. He was very fortunate and went to the right place. So this missing link was thought to be some kind of a fish, sea creature that came to land and developed legs and evolved. And fortunately, this young scientist, Neil Shubin, together with a group of people, in 2004, they discovered this little creature, the missing link, which was dated 375 million years ago. And they called it Tiktaalik. And this is basically a creature that evolved from the ocean life onto land, because it started to develop from the brainstem, it started to develop an emotional brain. Right? And that emotional brain made it fearful of larger predators. You know that fish today, many species of fish today have no fear. They're just swimming in a group, and then when the sharks come, the sharks just eat them at random. They don't know how to hide. You know, they don't know how to swim and hide. They still think that they can survive by numbers because they don't have that kind of fear that more evolved creatures have. So let's take a look at this creature called Tiktaalik. Now, this is just animation here. Huh?
Back at home, Shubin and his team got to work, examining their 375 million-year-old fossil. They named their new finding Tiktaalik, an Inuit word for a freshwater fish. Tiktaalik is a perfect transitional form. Much of its body is that of a fish. It's covered in scales. But it also had something very unfish-like. An arm-like fin, or perhaps a fin-like arm. Tiktaalik had the bone structure that is seen in the arms and legs of every four-limbed animal. One big bone at the top, two bones underneath, leading to a cluster of bones in the wrist and ankle. It's the same pattern that is found in everything from sheep to sheepdogs, to Shubin himself.
You now have an animal that can push itself up off the substrate, either on the water bottom or on land.
One obvious question was, why had Tiktaalik evolved this new structure? One possible answer is suggested by other fossils found near it.
There are large predatory fish about 10 to 15 feet long living alongside Tiktaalik.
Tiktaalik was prey. To survive, it had few choices.
You can get big, you can get armor, or you can get out of the way.
Shubin thinks Tiktaalik got out of the way. With those arm-like fins, it could have dragged itself to safety on land or in the shallows.
And basically that explains the evolution of the brain, that it started evolving limbic system, the emotional brain, and then eventually when it crawled up the trees and started to evolve into birds, the cerebral cortex started to form. So that's why birds also can solve problems. Some birds are very intelligent. So basically the brainstem is the survival brain, right? And it is most primitive part of the brain. And the limbic system is the emotional brain. This is the part of the brain that is able to sense fear and react to it. Right? Anxiety, fear, and all kinds of things. So in the ancient times, ancient land creatures only had up to this level of brain. And only when they evolved into birds and mammals, they started to evolve the cerebral cortex, which allowed them to think and solve problems. And the human being is the most advanced species of such animal. That's why we can think much better than the average animal. Most of us. So if you look back, this is really how it all kind of evolved. In the top section, they are basically only up to emotional brain. And then the thinking brain started with the birds, mammals, and then humans. Right? And then the human brain became very complex. So let's take a look at the complex human brain.
The brain controls every aspect of our lives. As humans have evolved, it's doubled in size. It weighs only 3 pounds, but it consumes 20% of all the fuel our bodies take in, generating enough energy to keep a light bulb burning.
And you have to consider the brain having evolved like an old house, where we just added different rooms. And so there's all these stairways and connections.
In the basement is the oldest part, called the brain stem. It's something we share with reptiles and other mammals. It's what keeps us alive, governing vital functions like heart rate, respiration, digestion, and blood pressure. Things that happen without having to think about them.
The next level up, the first floor, more evolved. Hundreds of thousands of years later, it's called the limbic system. And this is very important in the processing of emotions.
Within the limbic system are the amygdala, 2 nuggets of tissue, one in each half of the brain. They are no bigger than a fingernail, yet they are the brain's central command center for our emotional reactions. One of the simplest and strongest of these is fear, a primal emotion we all share.
If you had to pick one brain region that was most important in fear, it would be the amygdala.
What scientists discovered is that as humans evolved, another part of the brain, called the cortex, also became involved in processing fear.
The part that makes us most human about the brain is our frontal cortex.
If the amygdala is the first floor, the cortex is the second floor of the brain. It's the brain's thin, wrinkly outer layer that's divided into 4 sets of lobes.
you unfolded the cortex of a monkey, it would be about the size of a piece of paper. If you unfolded our cortex, it's about 4 sheets of paper large. And the reason it's wrinkly is because you have to squish that all inside of the skull.
The frontal lobes comprise the area just above our eyes, and these are the newest rooms of the brain. As humans evolved, the frontal lobes became the place where conscious, rational thought is processed. It's where we do our problem solving.
The frontal lobes are so interesting because they are really the conductor of the brain. They synchronize all activity.
Scientists made a major breakthrough in fear research when they found that information from our senses reaches the amygdala almost twice as fast as it takes to get to our frontal lobes. The speed of the different brain signals means unless we instinctively know how to react to a potential threat, we may freeze in fear, waiting for the frontal lobes to catch up to figure out the right response.
Part of what happens with fear and panic is the unknown, is not knowing what to do next, and so your brain essentially freezes the way a deer freezes in the headlight.
So the amygdala may get very fast signals about fear, but sometimes they're wrong, and quickly the situation may say to you, no, it's not a fear situation, and you're not afraid. So these very quick amygdala signals that you get can be controlled in sort of a top-down way.
So I will talk a little bit more about the amygdala and the cerebral cortex next week. I will just give a very rough idea now. Now, as the brain evolves, or rather as mammals evolve, 4-legged mammals begin to stand on 2 feet, and these are called bipedal mammals. And then as those who are able to stand on 2 feet, it is believed that they evolve into human beings. So let's take a look at the brain size. And they measure the brain size based on the average size of an adult skull. They look at the inside, the capacity inside, how much volume it can accommodate. And they use that as a way to assess the size of the brain of the various creatures. So we talk about our relatives, not us. They did not evolve into us. We did not evolve from chimpanzees. But we're just using them as an example. 5 million years ago, chimpanzees began to evolve. They started to appear. And then a species that stood up on 2 feet started to appear. And this, some scientists theorize, could be our ancestors. Some reject it as our ancestors, depending on which scientist you talk to. Australopithecus, and there are a number of different species. They started to appear around 3 million years ago. Our ancient ancestors are called hominids, Hominid, and there are up to 20 to 25 species of hominids, depending again on which scientist you talk to. But roughly, let's just say 20 species of hominids. The first known species of hominid is called Homo habilis. Now, they are given the word homo in front because it's hominid. And these are basically accepted as our ancient ancestors. So the first known so-called human, very ancient, primitive form of human started to appear around 2.5 million years ago. Homo habilis was known as the first one. Recently, some scientists started to discover there was a species older than that, but of course not a lot of people agree. So again, scientists are always debating. They love to debate, so let them debate. Maybe our grandchildren will learn the real thing by that time. Then came a very smart species, Homo erectus. They were smart because they started to appear around 1 or 1.5 million years ago, and they survived until roughly 100,000 years ago. That means they actually were the longest surviving hominid species. In fact, they discovered, and I'm not sure if it was Homo erectus, but they said they discovered up to 4 different Homo species coexisting at the same time, around 50 to 100,000 years ago. And that is humans, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and then there was one more. So Neanderthal came around 300,000 years ago. At that time, Homo sapiens had not evolved yet. And some people say, humans, Homo sapiens evolved from Neanderthals. Some say from Homo erectus. But from the bulk of the stuff that I read, it's more likely to be Homo erectus. Because the Neanderthal was known to be a pretty dumb species. Very dumb. Then Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens came, we are the last species to have evolved and remain. But don't think that we can survive long. It's only been 200,000 years since Homo sapiens started appearing. But Homo erectus survived more than 1 million years. Right? There was, okay, never mind. So if you were to take a look at brain size, chimpanzee, 400 cubic centimeter, right? 400 cc. Then those that stood up on 2 feet, the bipedal Australopithecus, they didn't come from Australia. They just used a name that sounded like Australia, Australopithecus. A little bit larger than the chimpanzee brain. Then the Homo habilis, substantially larger than the chimpanzee brain. That is the first human species. Now these drawings or these pictures are actually recreation based on their bone structure, and they are done by very well-trained and learned graphic artists or whatever, who are able to basically somehow recompose what that creature would look like. And then, of course, the Homo erectus. Homo erectus, you can now see it is more than double the size of its previous species, Homo habilis, 552 cc, but Homo erectus is 1000 cc, double the size already. And it's a very intelligent species because that's why they survive. They were the ones that made tools and adapted to the environment. They made, using skin of animal to make clothing, they survived. That's why they survived 1 million over years because of that. And then the Neanderthals, 50% larger brain size, but very dumb. Why? Because when they found the first species, the earliest Neanderthals, about 400,000 years ago, the kind of tools they were using were very primitive stone tools. No metal, no spear, nothing, just using stones only. Until they faded away about 50 to 100,000 years ago, they were still using the same kind of tools. They never learned. You know, over a period of 350,000 years, that species never learned how to improve on the tools they were using. Then that's why they concluded it's pretty dumb. Big brain with nothing inside. You know? And then, of course, there we are with slightly smaller brain than the Neanderthal. So now be aware, brain size alone does not determine intelligence. Yeah? That's why it is not a compliment to be called a Neanderthal. And basically, this is really how it has evolved. And you can see our human brain is 30 to 40% larger than the Homo erectus. And Homo erectus would be the next most intelligent species of all. So basically, in a nutshell, this is really the comparison of the cranial capacity in the skull and what it is. So we're going to talk about the thinking brain and the emotional brain next week. Right now, we just carry on with what Bhante pointed out in terms of Vijnana. Right? I had to show you that because you need to understand how brain had evolved and how we talk about ancient brains. Then we're talking about the brain that is basically purely emotional. That's why we say we only had chitta in ancient times. So our ancestors only had chitta, very little mano. Right? So we do not have this thing called the mind. We only have a thing called the body. And basically, the important thing that Bhante mentioned there is that Vijnana is the reaction of senses to stimulations from the environment. And it is not really consciousness. So what is it? Basically, there are these sense perceptions. From the eye, Chaku Vijnana, from the ear, Sota Vijnana, from the... Is that in the notes? Yeah. And then we have the Sota Vijnana, Gana Vijnana, and Jiva, Kaya Vijnana. These 5 are basically perceptions. But then, Mano Vijnana, the mind in itself, mano, the thinking mind, that is consciousness. Right? And consciousness is cognition and conception, being aware and able to think, and having the intellect to be able to understand activities going on. So this is really the most advanced part. And now let's see what Bhante said about mano, cognition. One moment.
Now, during the time of the Buddha, someone came and asked Buddha a question. We have these 5 senses, and each sense will give different information. The eye, the information we get from the eye is different from the information we get from the ear. It is a sound. And nose gives another kind of information. The tongue gives another kind of information. Now these different informations, they are different. But we mix these things together. Where does that mixing come? Where do they unite?
In the mind.
Then the Buddha said, mano. Mano is the place. And today, if we use the modern scientific thinking, all these information going from the senses go to the brain. And the brain begins to do the thinking. Put that information together and compare it with the past experiences and gives a meaning. So when I see a person coming here, if I have seen that person before, I will know that person. Or if I don't, at least I will see whether it is a man or a woman, or whatever it is.
Yes.
So the meaning is given by the thinking part, which is mano, which is the activity of the brain. There is no thinker as a separate person. It is the brain, and there is a part of the brain called the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex, which is doing the thinking. And mano really is not another person there or anything, but the body itself. The brain is a part of the body.
So what did Bhante say? He says, each sense produces different sensory information, feeding to the brain. Mano collects all the different sensory information and puts it all together. Mano compares it with past experience and gives meaning to it. And mano is not another person there. It is the brain itself. There is no person there. So basically, every sense organ feeds information into the brain. Mano collects it together and then starts to create concepts, interpreting the meaning. So therefore, you can look at it as this mano really is, mano vijnana is consciousness. That's the only vijnana that is consciousness. The other vijnana, the chakku vijnana, gana vijnana, jidva vijnana, they are not consciousness, they are just perception. Different from mano. So in other words, these 6 aspects of our sense doors, 5 of them are physically based, and they are the sense organs, fed in from the sense organ. The 6th one is different from the other 5. The 6th one compiles information from the other 5 and also brings information from memory. I'll touch on that in a moment. So those 5 physical senses are called perceptions because they are really what is perceived by each sense organ. And then mano itself is conception, and that is the beginning of the understanding of what is consciousness. Right? Then this is a level of intelligence that we call consciousness. And this is really what was recognized by categorization of what has been perceived. So if we look at what Bhante said, the important message here is that mano compares what was perceived with past experience, giving meaning to it. So now let's take a look at a flow chart of how that happens. Activity from the environment stimulating our 5 sense organs. And they produce perception, 5 kinds of perception. And then Mano puts it all together. Right? So when perceptions arrive into the brain, what we have is, let's say we see a dog, then basically the brain is aware of the object called dog. That's it. Or rather, the brain is just aware of some object. It doesn't know of the meaning of dog yet. So the awareness of the object is the awareness of Rupa. At this point, it's very important to remember, Bhante has always stated Rupa is not object. Commonly translated as object. Rupa is commonly translated as object, translated as matter, because they say it is form. Now, form is a correct word in a way, but some people translate form in an existential way. Form is basically describing that there is a certain outline, there is a certain dimensions to it, and that's form. But it doesn't refer to the object. So if I see this object, this thing, this is not Rupa. What is arising in my mind is Rupa. So in other words, Bhante has always pointed out, Rupa is the mental image of what you perceive, and there is a form to it. That form, like an outline, the color, the shape, there is a shape, there is an outline, that is the form, and that is arising in your mind. Not this object out there, that is not Rupa. But unfortunately, there are many teachers, translators, who call that Rupa. Rupa is that matter, the object. It's not. And unfortunately, if we were to stand firm on this and start to talk to other people about it, I can assure you there will be big arguments. And unfortunately, we don't have Bhante to defend it anymore. So you help yourself. When you start to point out that Rupa is mental image and everybody else disagrees with you, my advice is don't argue. Just stand back and say, okay, thank you. And don't get into an argument. This is one of those things that people will argue until the cows come home. That Rupa means the object out there. Matter, material, materiality, corporeality. These are all the words used to translate Rupa. Corporeality means something physically existing. Materiality is material, right? Matter, object. Now, what is then Nama? Right? Let's take a look. So, the Mano will then interpret this mental image by comparing it to memory of past experiences, categorized memory of past experiences. If you have seen an object before, or that kind of object, categorized object, then you can recognize it. Simple example, many of you would not have seen this. What is this? It's a mouse. But how many of you are seeing this for the first time? This particular mouse for the first time? Raise your hand, please. How many of you are seeing this mouse for the first time? Yes. And you know it's a mouse. Why? Because you have seen hundreds of mouse before. And all the different hundreds of mouse before, your mind has now formed some kind of category called a mouse. When you look at something that looks like it, it's called a mouse. That's why you call this a mouse. But you've not seen this object before. And this is the meaning. This is how it is. You see something, it resembles the category of what you have seen. And then you give it a name belonging to that category. How often have you come across someone in a shopping mall or railway station or somewhere and you thought it was somebody you knew and you greeted that person and suddenly you realize, oops, sorry, wrong number. Hasn't it happened to many of us? Why? Because that person has a facial image that resembles the person you know. Yeah? That's why. Categorized memory of past experiences. Someone you knew looked like that. Right? And therefore, you thought that's the person. But that's because of your Mano comparing it to memory, thinking that, it matches that category, then there it is. This process is called papancha. And this is really recognition. And then with recognition, you become aware of meaning. You give it meaning. And giving it meaning is conception. Giving it some meaning. Conceiving an idea behind it. Concept of an entity identified as a dog out there. That's nama. So what is nama? Nama is name, label, identification. Now, unfortunately, nama is also translated by other people as mind, mentality, right? The very common word translated from nama is mentality or mind. It's not. It's just a label you give to something you recognize. That's what nama is. Now I ask you, many Asian languages from time to time have words derived from Sanskrit. Nama, Rupa came from Sanskrit. There are words in Bahasa Malaysia that came from Sanskrit. What's the meaning of nama in Bahasa Malaysia? Name, label, identity. What's the meaning of Rupa? Appearance, form, image. So, is that clear now, what I'm trying to tell you? The meaning of nama, Rupa, where Bhante has very clearly taught us, it is mental image and a name we give it. Not corporeality and mentality. Right? Not matter and mind. These are existential thinking. Right? So I hope you realize that. And finally, now let's take a look at this last part. Chitta.
And then the other thing is, once you have given a meaning to what you saw, an emotion is aroused. That means you like that thing that you saw, or you hate that, or you are frightened of that, or you are worried about that. These are the emotions. And that emotional part is what the Buddha called chitta. So chitta is the emotional part, and according to the emotion that is aroused, an action takes place in the form of speech or behavior. And that is what is called karma. Karma is the action that goes. And the action can also have results, which may be, if you become angry and you begin to fight with people, other people might fight with you also. Or you might be taken to prison. These are the effects. Yeah. So those are the consequences of the action. So that is the vipaka. So all these things are just the body doing these things. There is no person or any mind as a separate thing that is doing anything.
So there's no thinker to do the thinking, so don't think.
What did Bhante say? He said, once a meaning is given from what was perceived, and this is given by the mano, then an emotion is aroused depending on whether the meaning attracts a feeling of pleasantness or unpleasantness. And chitta is the emotional part that is aroused. And according to the emotion that is aroused, then we do something. We want to do something and start to take action, either in the form of speech, by saying something, or behavior, by taking certain actions. And the action taken, this is karma. And every action we take produces some kind of results, consequence, and that is vipaka. And all this is really the reaction of this organism. And there is no person doing it. Right? So basically it's the organism doing it, reacting depending on what it interprets, what it perceives. Right? So in other words, this is really the fundamental understanding that it is really not a self being targeted. Right? And therefore, we are organisms in an environment. Let's take a look at the process. So, Environmental activities stimulate the sense organ, perception arise, cognitive process, mano arise to interpret it based on memory of past experiences, and then emotion is aroused. What happens when emotion is aroused? It starts to trigger reactions in the body, releasing hormones. And this is a biochemical reaction going on in the body, releasing these hormones. And these hormones cause tensions in the body. Then the body gets tense and you start to feel this tension. And this tension disturbs the mind. Now your chitta is trying to figure out, oh, I'm so angry because I don't like it. Or it can be something pleasant. Oh, I love it so much, I want more. Now, whether it is something pleasant or unpleasant, the reactions are very similar. For example, your muscles get tensed, your heart beats faster, your breathing deepens, your facial expression distorts, and then your voice gets louder. Example of someone, let's say, experiencing a very unpleasant situation. So he becomes angry. Okay. Experience of a durian lover walking into his neighbor's house and realize the neighbor is just about to have a durian party with Musang King, 3 big baskets of Musang King. He starts to open and he gets so excited. Right? Whether it is excitement or anger, it's the same. Muscles are tense, voice gets loud, heart beat faster, breathing deepens. It's the same. That reaction is called stress. So whether it is something pleasant or unpleasant, it is stress. Dukkha. We are experiencing dukkha all the time. So even if you're enjoying durian, you're experiencing dukkha. And you can even, that dukkha, that enjoyment can also turn into anger. Because if your neighbor opened the last one and there's one seat left, and just as you're about to take it, the guy next to you grabbed it first. You think you're going to smile at him and say, oh, enjoy. You're going to go, from to You see? That's all dukkha. So you begin to want to do something. Now you get excited. Your body changes. Your chitta reacts. So this wanting to do something is volition, chetana. And then it leads to action, either speech or physical action. And that's karma. Whatever you do, you create some kind of consequence, vipaka. And it will come back to haunt you. It can haunt you immediately. It can haunt you later on. It can haunt you later in life. It can haunt you at your deathbed. Or it can haunt you in future life. Right? Your way and how you get reborn. So basically, this is the first lesson or foundation of what Bhante taught us. And with this foundation, it will help you to understand the next thing I'm going to talk about next week. And that is about our emotional reaction and our thinking, our mano and chitta. Okay? So, for those of you who wish, you may download it. Take note of this. tiny.cc/review01. So I'm going to number all the reviews one by one from now on. I won't put dates, I won't put topic, so that the name is short. You can remember it. You don't even need to worry. You can easily remember it. Tiny.cc. All my links start with tiny.cc. Very easy to remember. Review 01. Small cap. And if you are interested in joining my mailing list, please drop me a note at my email address. If you want to join the WhatsApp group, drop me a note at my mobile number.
Namo tassa bhagavata arahata sammasambuddhassa.